I'm Philip Ball and I'm a freelance science writer. And my lecture is about colour and chemistry and art. It's specifically about how the invention of new colours by chemistry throughout the ages has affected the way that artists have made use of colour. And it brings out the fact that you can see very, very definite stages in the history of art where the availability of new colours completely transformed what artists could do and changed the styles of painting as well as simply the colours of painting. And I want to show how these changes in art were linked to advances in chemical technology, whether it's in ancient Egypt or in 19th century Europe, and that it's because of these technological changes which provided not just colours but all sorts of daily materials. It's because of this that sometimes art has changed what it's done. Thank you very much. I want to start here. This exhibition happened, 3 years ago now, and it was an exhibition of Van Gogh's work at the Royal Academy, and in particular it showed a lot of Van Gogh's letters, and it was praised by several reviewers as having revised our view of the artist, because rather than showing him as painting in a crazed frenzy, as the romantic legend would have us believe, his letters showed him to be rather thoughtful and methodical about his technique. Now, this was no surprise to anyone who already knew about the wonderful letters that Van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo, because they revealed a passionate man, but someone passionate not so much about love and death, so much as about art, and in particular about the techniques and materials of art. One of the things that inspired Van Gogh most were the colours that he used, especially the new colours that had only recently become available in his time. In one letter to Theo, he wrote this: "I've got new ideas and I have new means of expressing what I want because better brushes will help me, and I am crazy about those two colours, carmine and cobalt. Cobalt is a divine colour, and there is nothing so beautiful for putting atmosphere around things. Carmine is the red of wine, and it is warm and lively like wine. The same with emerald green. It is bad economy not to use these colours. The same with cadmium." This focus on materials isn't unusual among artists. Van Gogh's friend Paul Gauguin, the subject of another recent blockbuster exhibition, this one at the Tate Modern, spent his time on Tahiti, fretting not so much about metaphysical questions of where we're from and where we're going, or about sexual relations that he had with the Tahitian women, but about the very prosaic difficulty of getting hold of the paints that he needed. And I think there's a metaphor here for the way we traditionally think about art. Art historians have tended to analyse paintings in intellectual terms, asking what the artist is trying to say, what feelings is he or she trying to convey. But painters themselves are more often concerned with the practical issues of creating a painting. One of the things that preoccupies them most is physical paint. Take a look, for example, at this picture by Wassily Kandinsky. It confronts us with all sorts of questions about style and form and intention, such as whether these shapes have particular meanings and why Kandinsky was led into this abstract form of expression. But I'd suggest that the first thing that strikes you about this picture is the vibrancy, the richness and the exuberance of its colours. It's become rather rare for art critics and historians to ask where these colours actually come from and how their availability has influenced what's depicted. And we take these colours for granted now. You can walk into an art shop and find rack upon rack of them. If you look closely at the labels, you'll find that many of them contain chemicals with complicated and daunting names like quinacridone and phthalocyanine. And a chemist will tell you that these are the products of the modern chemical age. So were they available to Kandinsky in 1913? How about Monet or Turner or Rembrandt? I'm going to look at this issue of how art got its colours, and in particular, I want to raise the question, how has the invention of new colour affected the directions that art has taken? Now, it might seem a little strange to study art by looking at its materials, But that wouldn't have seemed strange at all to painters of the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. They were deeply engaged with their materials, and this was out of sheer necessity because they knew that they often had to make their own paints, and they knew that the quality of their art depended vitally on the quality of these materials. And although that's still true today, few contemporary artists have a comparable relationship with the physical nature, the characteristics of the medium that they use. And one suspects that there's a perception almost of something vulgar about these tangible aspects of art. And this means not only that some artists have undertaken ill-informed and sometimes disastrous experiments with paints in modern times, but that art itself is in danger of losing touch with its roots as a practical craft. The most ancient art that we know of, painted 15 millennia ago in the caves of Lascaux, used pigments that were dug straight out of the earth. These were ground up minerals such as red and yellow ochre and chalk. And these so-called earth colours are generally rather dull. The ochres are iron-rich minerals, chemically similar to rust. For black, cave artists used charcoal. And so the most common colours were those that nature offered most abundantly, and these were black, white, and this kind of dirty red and yellow. Now, in 1969, two anthropologists, Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, claimed that colour words appear in all languages in the same sequence. Some Aboriginal languages distinguish only two colours, black and white. Others have three, black, white, and red. And what Kay and Berlin said is that there's always the same sequence with which new coloured words are added. So after black, white, and red, you'll always get either yellow or green, followed by the next of those two. So this quartet of black, white, red, and yellow corresponds to a kind of universal four-colour scheme. You'll never find languages with, say, terms for just red, yellow, and blue. It seems unlikely to be a coincidence that these four basic colours are the ones that nature offers most readily. Well, the Egyptians used these pigments too, but they had a broader palette. Egypt in the 3rd millennium BC had a surprisingly sophisticated chemical technology because this was a product of the crafts that were central to everyday life and to religious life. And in fact, in Egypt, artists were priests and art was considered a devotional practice. Artworks were thought to acquire a supernatural power through religious ceremonies, and so the production of pigments to make them was a socially important task. And one of the most renowned pigments of the ancient world was Egyptian blue. And this was made by grinding up a copper-containing compound. Chemically, it's calcium copper silicate. And this was an artificial substance. It was made by melting sand together with copper minerals and chalk. And it was probably discovered as an offshoot of the manufacture of blue glazed stones called faience, which were first made in Mesopotamia around 4500 BC. The faience was used for decorative purposes, and it stimulated experiments with materials and with the design of kilns that probably also led to the discovery of glass and to the discovery of how to smelt copper, how to extract copper from its minerals, which stimulated the beginnings of the Bronze Age. So this blue pigment arose by chance as a side product from a technology developed for making something else entirely. And this is a common pattern for pigment discovery, which recurs right through to the 20th century. Without the social demand for substances such as glass, soap, metals, dyes, and plastics, it's unlikely that many of the technologies for pigment manufacture would have evolved or would have been economically viable. And so the artist's palette is partly a byproduct of industrial technology. Well, the Egyptians also knew how to use simple chemistry to make other artificial colours, artificial whites and yellows and reds and greens, such as verdigris, which was made by letting vinegar fumes corrode copper. And so their colour scheme was really quite rich. And the Greeks inherited a lot of this technology, but they didn't necessarily use all of these colours. Some of the most renowned painters of classical Greece, this was the period between about 600 and 400 BC, such as Apelles, the court painter of Alexander the Great, they chose to restrict their palettes to just four colours. And sure enough, these were those original four, black, white, red, and yellow. Nearly all Greek painting has now been lost, but here's a Roman mosaic from Pompeii which reproduces an original Greek painting. It's actually a painting of Alexander the Great, and it gives you an impression of the muted palette that the Greeks used. Now, it's not clear why this four-colour palette evolved. One idea is that as the Greeks moved beyond the flat two-dimensional pictograms that the Egyptians used and started to depict three-dimensional shading, they found it difficult to achieve a harmonious balance of colour if they tried to use too many colours. But whatever the case, this austere four-colour palette was eventually deemed to be the proper, the dignified choice for all serious artists. And this was a prejudice that persisted in imperial Rome. So you can find Pliny in the 1st century AD condemning artists who used the bright, so-called florid colours that could be imported from the East. These colours became available from places like India ever since Alexander's conquests in the East. And Pliny feared that the sensuousness of these oriental colours would corrupt the supposed purity of artistic expression that was developed in ancient Greece. Well, unfortunately for Pliny, public taste was more vulgar than that. It delighted in bright colours, and whatever he said, it didn't stop craftsmen from using bright colours for interior decorating, and you can see that from some of the surviving murals at Pompeii. Unfortunately, these mural techniques used in the ancient world don't tend to preserve the colours well. Once they're exposed to sun and to air, they discolour or they fade or they flake off. And this has left a lot of these buildings and statues drab and plain, and give the impression that the classical world was actually a much more drab and pale place than it really was. Now, chemical technology thrived in what we have in the past labelled the Middle Ages, labelled the Dark Ages, particularly in the 8th and 9th centuries. And this happened not in the traumatised Christian West, but in the Islamic Middle East, where Arabic scholars mixed Greek philosophy with the practical skills that flourished in Alexandrian Egypt. And these were blended together in the art of alchemy. Now, alchemy is still widely misunderstood today. Either it's seen as a misguided or a fraudulent attempt to make gold, or as some kind of metaphor for a spiritual transformation. Some alchemy was undoubtedly done by tricksters or deluded gold makers, but it's now generally regarded by science historians as having broader objectives, and in fact that it's really a kind of pre-scientific chemical technology. The Italian craftsman Cennino Cennini wrote a craftsman's manual around 1390 describing many of the pigments that were then available and how to make them or how to get hold of them. And he makes a lot of mention of alchemy, but it's clear that for him this isn't some esoteric or mystical art. It's simply a convenient manufacturing process for his colours. Now, it's no coincidence that alchemists were making colours for artists, because colour is central to the process of alchemy. To make the philosopher's stone, the substance that could allegedly transform base metals into gold, one had to conduct chemical reactions that would take the raw materials through a specified sequence of colour changes. And so it's not surprising to find the alchemists focusing their attention on the substances that offered a wide range of different colours and that turned out to be the same materials that artists would be using. Take lead, for example. It starts off as this dull, uninspiring stuff, but it was known since ancient times that if you expose lead metal to the fumes of vinegar and animal dung, it turns white, owing to the formation of lead carbonate. And this was known as white lead, and it was the painter's finest white pigment right up until the 19th century. But if you roast this white lead carefully in air, you can convert it to lead tetroxide, which is red. And this pigment, it was simply called red lead, was used in the classical world at least since the 2nd century AD. Cennino Cennini says simply that it's manufactured by alchemy. In Latin, it was known as minium, and its extensive use in medieval illuminated manuscripts is what gives us the word miniature. It's purely coincidental that these works tended to be small. They had to be small to fit on the page. The Indian and Persian miniatures of the 17th to the 19th centuries also use a great deal of red lead, and they're finely detailed, but there's nothing small about them at all. Now, further roasting of red lead can lead to a yellow material, lead monoxide or litharge. And this was used in the Middle Ages as a pigment called massicot. Now, to us, there's nothing extraordinary about these reactions of lead with various gases, but to the alchemists, they would have been seen as evidence of some fundamental change that was purifying the lead, bringing it closer to the colour of gold. Yet the finest red pigment of the Middle Ages was, for the alchemists, perhaps the most fascinating substance of all. You see, the Islamic alchemists had the idea that all metals are composed of two basic substances, or principles, sulfur and mercury. Now, these alchemical principles aren't exactly the same as the sulfur and mercury that you can get from minerals dug out of the earth. But nevertheless, if you do combine those two elements, this yellow sulfur, which exists in the elemental form in nature, and the liquid silvery metal mercury, if you combine them together and heat them up, something miraculous happens. They combine to form a hard blackish red material, mercury sulfide, which, when it's ground up finely, turns out to have a glorious red colour, and painters knew this as vermilion. The 11th century Benedictine monk Theophilus describes how to make vermilion in his own craftsman's manual, and he gives a very detailed account of how to do this, which is really as detailed as pretty much any description of a chemical synthesis in the 18th or 19th century. Chinino can't be doing with going through all of that. He simply advises the painters to go and get their vermilion ready-made from the alchemists. But he warns them not to get it ready ground like this, because some alchemists had a tendency to mix it up with brick dust to make it go further. The art historian Daniel Thompson has claimed that the invention of vermilion was the central innovation of medieval art. He says this: "No other scientific invention has had so great and lasting an effect upon painting practice as the invention of this colour. Given abundant vermilion, the standard of intensity in the painter's palette automatically rises. Equally brilliant blues and greens and yellows were required to go with it. If the Middle Ages had not had this brilliant red, they would hardly have developed the standards of colouring which they upheld, and there would have been less use for the inventions of the other brilliant colours which came on the scene in and after the 12th century." And we can see how much medieval artists loved vermilion by the way they would sometimes apply it in great swathes, in great blocks of colour for everyone to marvel at. Medieval art, with its cartoon-like quality and its lack of perspective and its blocks of unshaded colours, sometimes looks odd to us, but we have to remember that the aim of the medieval artist was not to paint realistically. The subjects were almost always religious, and the artists, who were often themselves monks, believed, like the Egyptians, that paintings had a symbolic religious power, and that this was enhanced if one used the finest materials and displayed them unmixed with anything else. So medieval works are rich in fine materials like this, like vermilion, and also gold leaf. You can see gold leaf in the surrounding in this painting. And then also in the later Middle Ages in a still more wondrous pigment. That's this one, ultramarine. Chinino says of it, "Ultramarine blue is a colour illustrious, beautiful, and most perfect, beyond all other colours. One could not say anything about it or do anything with it that its quality would not still surpass." Now, as its name implies, ultramarine came from over the seas, because the mineral from which it was made was not known anywhere in the West at that time. It's prepared from the mineral lapis lazuli, and this is a blue stone that at that time was found only in one place in the world, in some mines in what is now Afghanistan. So for centuries, all of Europe depended on these remote Afghan mines for their most precious pigment, and it cost more than its weight in gold. Now, ultramarine was precious not just because it was a rare import, but because it was very laborious to make. Most mineral pigments are made just by grinding up the mineral into a powder, but if you do that with lapis lazuli, the results are disappointing because there are impurities in there and they turn it a greyish colour. So those had to be separated from the blue stuff, and that was done by mixing the powdered mineral with wax and washing it and kneading it again and again in water to flush out the blue stuff. So it was a very laborious process of preparation, which also contributed to its cost. Now, in most of the altarpieces of the Middle Ages, the Virgin Mary is shown in blue robes. Here's an example from Duccio in the 14th century. And various art theorists, even in modern times, have attempted to explain the symbolic significance of this blue. They say that it conveys humility or virtue or whatever. But the main reason for this choice of colour is that the artist would naturally have lavished the most precious pigment on the most holy aspect of the painting. So you can see that art can become harder to interpret if you ignore the materials that it's made from. So then ultramarine, vermilion and gold leaf can be considered the primary blue and red and yellow of the Middle Ages. They were the most precious paints that a painter could acquire, and some altarpieces use little else. But by the 15th century, as we approach the period of the High Renaissance, things were different. And this is how they were different. This is Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne. It's painted in 1523, and it's one of the most radiant images in Western art. I think it shows why Titian is considered to be one of the finest colourists of all time. And you can see at once that this is a completely different sort of painting than those from the Middle Ages. There are many reasons for this. Now we can see now people and places depicted realistically, which is to say, in an attempt to show how they would look if you were an observer actually in this scene. So light and shade and perspective, proportion, anatomy, all of these are accurately observed. And this is the key feature of Renaissance humanism, where actual human experience became the central concern of artists and writers. And so it wasn't any longer sufficient to produce the stylized, iconic works that just paid lip service to the shapes and the forms of the real world. So Renaissance artists instead put the viewer right into the picture. And this meant that the materials of the painter no longer had the symbolic values that they had in the Middle Ages. Ultramarine was prized now simply because it was a beautiful and pleasing colour, and also because it showed off the wealth of the patron who had paid for the painting, and not so much because because its expense made it some kind of devotional offering to God. Gold leaf gradually disappears from use during the 15th century because no matter how costly it was, that counted for nothing if it didn't produce a realistic effect. Painters instead began to mimic gold using yellow and white and brown pigments instead. And Titian's paints are also totally different to those of medieval artists. Pigments have to be mixed with some fluid binding medium to make them into a paint, and in the Middle Ages that binder was often egg yolk. But Titian and his contemporaries mixed their colours with oils. Now this oil painting technique was perfected in Northern Europe in the early 15th century by artists such as Jan van Eyck, and they were gradually adapted by the Italians from about the middle of that century. In the earlier so-called egg tempera method, the paints dry very quickly, but oils are much slower in drying, and this meant that colours could be blended and mixed, and so it permits the soft shadows and the subtle shading that we see in Renaissance art. Now the use of oils also compelled a change in pigment use, because some colours look different when they're bound in oil from when they're bound in water or egg yolk, because these binders have different refractive indices. In particular, ultramarine and vermilion are both more transparent and less brilliant in oil, and this meant that painters had to adulterate these colours by mixing a little bit of white in there to make them opaque. And this began to erode the mystique that colours like ultramarine had. As a result, artists began to feel more free to use a wider range of blues in their works. The art historian Paul Hills says that blue by the 15th century was moving away from its association with starry night, the vault of the heavens, to the changeful sky of day. So this was a change in colour use instigated by the physics and chemistry of the materials. But there were other reasons why Titian and his contemporaries had a wider range of colours available to them than most medieval artists, because Titian lived and worked in Venice, which, along with Florence, was the artistic capital of Renaissance Italy. But Venice was also a port where many of the rare spices and textiles and foods and pigments arrived from the east. So the Venetian artists had their first pick of these colours, and they made abundant use of it, and Venetian art is particularly colourful. And in Bacchus and Ariadne, Titian uses just about every one of the pigments available in the early 16th century. And in doing so, he provides us almost with a map of the state of 16th century chemistry. The brilliant sky here is ultramarine, and so is Ariadne's robe. But the sea, you can see the sea has a kind of greenish tint, and this is a different blue mineral. It's called azurite, and it's a copper mineral. It had been known since ancient times, and there were deposits of it in Europe, which helped to make it cheaper. Imported ultramarine rarely made its way all the way to Northern Europe, and at least at an affordable price. And so azurite is the main blue of the works of the Dutch and German artists in the Renaissance. There's vermilion here too in Ariadne's robes, in Ariadne's scarf. But there's also another kind of red pigment here called red lake. And this is made from red dyes, which are organic materials. There are extracts from plants and from animals. So some red lakes were made from the extracts of Brazil wood and madder root. Others came from animals, like the cochineal that was made from ground up dried beetles. And these dyes were converted to so-called lake pigments by dissolving the colouring agents in water and then fixing them on the surface of fine white particles. And this procedure was known in the Middle Ages, but it wasn't really perfected until the Renaissance. And these red lakes are darker and richer than vermilion. There's a common red lake known as kermes, which is the root of our word crimson. And lakes are also translucent when they're mixed in oils. And Renaissance painters often used them as translucent glazes to cover over other colours to give these rich flesh tones, or to make purples by glazing red over blue. There are other yellows in here too. Renaissance yellows were typically compounds of lead and tin and antimony. Now, the Egyptians had known how to make some of these too. But in Bacchus and Ariadne, there's also a brighter yellow pigment, which is called orpiment. And this is arsenic sulfide. The name orpiment simply means pigment of gold. And it can be found naturally in a mineral form, but a better quality of pigment could be made artificially through alchemy. It's also because it's arsenic containing, it's highly poisonous, and some painters avoided using it for this reason. And Cennino warns anyone who uses it to look out for yourself. He said, make sure that you don't get it in your mouth by licking your brush. One northern painter who did use this stuff was Lucas Cranach, and that's probably because Cranach was himself an alchemist, a pharmacist. He ran a pharmacy, and so he was very knowledgeable about the methods of alchemy. Also in this picture, there's an orange pigment, the only pure orange pigment that was known until the 19th century. And it's a pigment called realgar, which is a different form of arsenic sulfide. And this also occurs naturally, and it was imported into Europe through Venice from Romania and from the East. And again, it's very expensive and poisonous, and so rarely used in European art. Now, something happened to colour during the 17th and 18th centuries. Rubens often painted as brightly as Titian, but we remember this period more for the subdued palettes of people like Rembrandt and Van Dyck and Poussin. European art went through a period of subdued colour at that time, and there wasn't much innovation in pigment manufacture during this period. And it's interesting that several of the new colours that did appear were the autumnal colours that typify painters like Rembrandt. The prevailing attitude of the connoisseurs by the early 19th century was summed up by Sir George Beaumont, who was himself an artist, and he was also a patron of John Constable. And he claimed that a good picture, like a good fiddle, should be brown. And here is Constable, apparently eager to please his patron, I think. And if these pictures weren't brown enough already, Victorian conservators often made them more so by giving them a coat of muddy varnish. Now, in Constable's defence, it's said that he is said to have protested against what Beaumont said by taking a violin and placing it on grass to show how different the two colours really were. But nevertheless, he clearly respected the convention that expected artists to tone down their colours. In fact, he was considered for his time an innovator with an unusually bright palette, and I think that tells us something about how truly murky colour has become by the early 19th century. And I want to have a look at some of these autumnal colours. For Baroque painters who liked their works dark and golden, there was a substance called Cassel earth. This was a peaty substance with a warm brown colour. Van Dyck liked it so much that it later became known by his name as Van Dyck Brown. And there was stuff called bitumen. It was literally that. It was an appalling tarry brown pigment that never dried and has ended up ruining several 19th century paintings, such as this one, Jericho's Raft of the Medusa, which is more or less never exhibited now because it's in such a terrible state. There was also a yellow substance that was imported from India, and this was quite mysterious. It was just known as Indian yellow. It was imported by the Dutch, and it was used by Rembrandt a lot. And for a long time, no one knew what it was made of. It turned out in the late 19th century, it was found that it was made from the urine of cows fed exclusively on mangoes. But in the late 18th century, things began to change because a new rainbow began to spread across the artist's palette. This was the golden age of chemistry. It was when new elements were being discovered all the time and when the French chemist Antoine Lavoisier was starting to make sense of chemical transformations, largely through his discovery of the element oxygen. Now, that discovery itself is contentious, and some claim that the first person to see oxygen was actually the Swedish apothecarist Carl Wilhelm Scheele. And Scheele was certainly one of the greatest experimental chemists of his time. He isolated hydrogen and barium and chlorine. And in 1775, Scheele discovered a green substance while he was experimenting on arsenic compounds. And this was copper arsenite, which soon became used as a green pigment simply called Scheele's green. And this was brighter than any of the earlier pure green pigments. Until then, many painters had to make greens by mixing some blue with some yellow. But Scheele's green was itself eclipsed by the discovery in 1814 of a new, even more attractive arsenic-based green pigment, which became known in England as emerald green or Paris green. Now, unfortunately, this too was also poisonous. And these arsenic greens, if they were exposed to dampness, they decomposed into a toxic arsenic-containing gas. But because they were quite cheap to manufacture, emerald green and Scheele's green were used not only as artist materials, but also as commercial colours, as household paints, and on patterned wallpaper. And this made damp rooms potential death traps. And around the middle of the 19th century, there were fears expressed that young children were being killed by the deadly fumes emanating from their bedroom walls. Some people believe that Napoleon's death in exile on St. Helena was also hastened this way. But perhaps the most important innovations in artist colours in the 19th century stemmed from the discovery in the late 18th century of a bright red mineral from Siberia. This stuff, it's called crocoite, or Siberian red lead. And in the early 19th century, the French chemist Nicolas Louis Vauquelin investigated this mineral and discovered that it contained a new metallic element whose compounds were brightly coloured. And for that reason, he gave it the a name meaning, in Greek, meaning colour, chrome. And of course, now we know this element as chromium. And crocoite is a mineral form of lead chromate. When Vauquelin made this same compound synthetically, he found that it had a bright yellow colour, and this was a very cheap pigment to make, and it was used commercially. It was used to paint carriages, which is kind of a nice sort of foreshadowing of its use on the yellow cabs of New York today. Vauquelin found he could also make a different form of lead chromate that was orange, and this was the first pure orange pigment since poisonous realgar. And chromium oxide was a green colour, which, if you made it in a way that incorporated a little water into the crystals, it provided a very rich green pigment in England called Viridian. And there was just a flood of these new colours in the early 19th century. In 1817, the German chemist Friedrich Strohmeyer discovered a new element called cadmium, which was a byproduct of zinc smelting. And he found that cadmium could be combined with sulfur to make bright yellow and orange pigments called cadmium yellow and cadmium orange. And then in the early 20th century, a red version of this pigment became very popular too. Matisse was particularly fond of it. In the late 18th century, the French government considered pigment manufacture to be now so commercially important that it appointed some of its leading chemists to discover new pigments. And the government asked Louis-Jacques Thénard to look for a synthetic substitute for ultramarine, which was still expensive. And in 1802, Thénard found how to make a rich blue colour from cobalt, and this was simply known as cobalt blue. And cobalt turned out to offer several other colours too. In the 1850s, a yellow pigment called auréolin became available in France, and then that was soon followed by the first ever pure purple pigment, cobalt violet. And a sky blue pigment containing cobalt was also later invented, which became known as cerulean blue from its resemblance to the colour of the sky. But what painters really wanted in their blues was a cheaper form of ultramarine itself. And in 1824, the French Society for Encouragement of National Industry offered a prize for the first practical synthesis of ultramarine. It's a complicated stuff to make, partly because its blue colour comes not, as in most pigments, from the presence of a particular metal, but from the presence of sulphur in the crystal structure. But it took only 4 years, in 1828, for a Frenchman named Jean-Baptiste Guimet to claim this prize by making synthetic ultramarine, which therefore thereafter widely became known as French ultramarine. So pigment manufacture was now a big business. It wasn't any longer the cottage industry that it was when apothecaries were making this stuff. And factories were set up in the 19th century to make and to grind pigments. And some of them sold these pigments in pure form to artist suppliers, who then mix up the paint for their customers by mixing the pigments and oil. But some pigment manufacturers, like Reeves and Winsor & Newton in England, started to provide ready-made oil paints, which from the 1840s they sold in collapsible tin tubes. Now, this meant that painters themselves were becoming ever less familiar with what it was that they were buying, and they had no way of assessing the quality of this profusion of colours. And so a new breed of professional began to appear, called the colour man, who knew what the artists needed, but also had some chemical knowledge that enabled them to assess the quality of materials. And in England, the foremost colour man of the 19th century was George Field. He supplied paints to Turner and to the pre-Raphaelites. And we can see what sort of difference these colours made by looking at Jean Millet's Ophelia. Compare this picture to Constable just less than 20 years earlier, and see how different in particular the greens are, how vibrant they've become. In fact, they were too vibrant for some critics. One of them called the greens here unripe enough to cause indigestion. But these painters relied on Field's judgment about whether or not a colour was reliable. For example, whether it would fade or discolour rapidly on the canvas. And thanks to Field in particular, Turner was able to acquire these new colours almost as soon as they were invented. And he was among the first painters in England to use cobalt blue and emerald green and viridian and chrome yellow and others. This was still a gamble, because even with the assistance of someone like Field, some of these colours might end up losing their brilliance over several years. And in fact, some of Turner's works have suffered this way. But all the same, Turner remains one of the greatest innovators in colour, and he brought a blaze of Venetian brightness to the dour palettes of the early 19th century. You can see that here. This is his painting Ulysses deriding Polyphemus, which was considered shocking by some contemporary critics. One of them said of this picture that it was a specimen of colouring run mad, positive vermilion, positive indigo, and all the most glaring tints of green, yellow and purple. Another, I think, more perceptive observer compared Turner to a Rembrandt born in India. Turner's use of colour was an important influence on the Parisian Impressionists, such as Monet, who came to London to see his work. The Impressionists made equally avid use of these new colours, and the shock of seeing their work wasn't just that of seeing a new style of painting without the clear edges and the smooth finish that the French Academy of Fine Arts preferred, but also of seeing colours that had never been seen before on canvas. in this picture, Boating on the Seine by Renoir, apart from the traditional lead white, there are just 7 pigments in here, and all but the reds are these modern synthetic colours: cobalt blue, viridian, chrome yellow, lemon yellow, which is another chromate colour, and chrome orange. And some of them are applied unmixed, straight from the tube, in particular with the placing of these very rich colours so that the complementaries stand next to each other. The blue and the orange complementary colours stand against each other and provide this very rich contrast. The Impressionist style shaped the early work of many of the most important painters of the modern age. Cézanne began as an Impressionist, and Van Gogh's work was transformed when he came to Paris and saw these paintings. They gave him the inspiration to use bold, unmixed new colours with glaring brilliance like this. With these harsh dissonances in this work, they called the Night Café, Van Gogh said that I've tried to show that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. Henri Matisse was also an Impressionist early in his career, but he made later use of these new pigments to even more stunning effect as the figurehead of the movement known as the Fauves, a French word meaning wild beast, which reflected their uninhibited use of these bright colours. And Fauvism made colour a central constructive component of art. And Kandinsky initially painted in this Fauve style, and he went on to try to discover a universal emotional language of colour itself. None of this would have been possible without the development of the vibrant new pigments in the 19th century. And this explosion of colour wasn't just confined to art. As chemistry blossomed, it brought colour into the wider world, especially when in the mid-19th century, chemists discovered how to make new dyes from the aromatic hydrocarbons found in coal tar, which was the residue of gas lamp burning. And these new dyes created very garish fashions. The 1850s in particular became known as the Purple Decade, as you can see reflected in this painting here. I just wanted to give a little word of caution here, actually, because when I was finding some of these images online, if you do a search for something like this, you'll find also images like this coming up, and it's just a reminder of how dependent on whatever technology you're using the colours that you see are going to be. There's still a problem in reproducing colours accurately. But anyway, this picture was painted in the year that the first coal tar dye was discovered. And it was discovered by William Perkin, who at that stage was just a teenager at the Royal College of Chemistry in London. And he'd been set the task of trying to synthesize quinine, the anti-malarial drug. But instead he found that he made a kind of a brown gunk which just settled at the bottom of his flask. But he found that he could extract from this a brilliant purple colour, which turned out to be a very effective dye for silk. And he managed to persuade his brother and his father to set up a business with him. He quit his studies and set up a business in Harrow, a factory to manufacture this colour, which became known as mauve. And this began the whole chemical industry. So these coal tar dyes started to come one after another. And following that, chemists found ways to make synthetic versions of natural dyes, such as the colorants in madder red and in indigo. And this meant that the dye dye cultivating industries in the colonies, the European colonies, collapsed. But the chemical industry thrived. And many of the chemical giants of today, Hearst and BASF, Agfa, Bayer, Ciba-Geigy, all began their lives as colour manufacturers. This is one of the early dye colour charts of the Bayer company. Now, the pigments of modern times encode their own stories about how art evolved in the 20th century. And if I had time, I'd say something about the day-glow colours of Andy Warhol or Roy Lichtenstein, or how people like Frank Stella began using commercial paints. They just went into the paint shops and bought whatever was available and used them for their art. And so their palettes were at the mercy of what commercial colour makers were producing for completely different purposes. But I want to finish by talking about, it's a little parable really, about chemistry and colour in art, which is the story of the world's most beautiful blue. And it's a story about the French artist Yves Klein, who was never a painter in the league of Turner and Rembrandt or Titian, but who is remembered for one thing, which was International Klein Blue, which he used for a series of monochrome paintings in the 1950s. And Klein believed, and in fact he then went on and did himself, that painters would eventually paint in just one single colour. That colour itself would be all that you needed to say. And Klein's blue here is nothing other than ultramarine. It's actually just synthetic ultramarine. But ultramarine never looked like this before, and you can't even do it justice in a reproduction like this. You've got to see the originals, because the quality of it is all about the texture, the luster of the material, because Klein realised that if you look at ultramarine powder, it has a real luster to it that you lose when you mix with a binder. And he wanted to try to preserve that luster with some kind of binder. And in 1955, he found his answer. He found that a synthetic fixative resin manufactured by the Rhone-Poulenc Chemicals Company could be made to act as a binder that retained this chromatic strength of ultramarine. And Klein collaborated with the Parisian manufacturer and retailer of artist materials named Edouard Adam to develop a recipe for this binder for ultramarine, and to protect this wonderful new paint from misuse that he felt might compromise the purity of his idea. He patented this colour in 1960. And the significance of this little episode in art history is not only to show that some artists were still, even then, depending on chemical assistance in the modern era, but also to show that the intimate relationship of painters with their materials hasn't been entirely severed. Today, painting is an unfashionable art. Many young artists want to work instead in sculpture or installation or video. And while this itself leads to some interesting new directions in colour, it's hard to imagine that paint has really nothing more to say about colours. There are still painters who care deeply about colour, but they're few and they're rarely young. And in an age when painters seem to have more choice of materials than ever before, this might seem strange. But I can't help wondering whether, in a way, that surplus of choice might contain the very problem, that artists have lost confidence in paint because they no longer feel that they understand it. And I can't help but feel sad at how different this is from the spirit that is apparent in an account by the photographer Brassai of a conversation that he had with Picasso. And this is what Brassai said. Then the man in the blue silk suit, this is Picasso, reaches into his pocket and takes out a large sheet of paper, which he carefully unfolds and hands to me. It is covered with Picasso's handwriting, less spasmodic, more studied than usual. At first sight, it resembles a poem. 20 or so verses are assembled in a column, surrounded by broad white margins. Each verse is prolonged with a dash, occasionally a very long one. But it is not a poem. It is Picasso's most recent order for colours. For once, all the anonymous heroes of Picasso's palette trooped forth from the shadows, with permanent white at their head. Each had distinguished himself in some great battle: the Blue Period, the Rose Period, Cubism, Guernica. Each could say, I too, I was there. And Picasso, reviewing his old comrades in arms, gives to each of them a sweep of his pen, a long dash that seems a fraternal salute. Welcome, Persian red. Welcome, emerald green, cerulean blue, ivory black, cobalt violet, clear and deep. Welcome, welcome. Thank you very much.